Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Moonlight Graham, and welcome to the third episode of Covert and Classified. There is a term that I find very moving and compelling. That would be the term, the fog of war. War is the realm of uncertainty, confusion, and where nothing is ever always black and white, but sometimes gray and hazy. One country's hero is another country's mortal enemy. During World War II, all the major countries who participated in that war, like Germany, England, Japan, and the United States, all used propaganda to generate hatred and prejudice towards their enemies. They did this by use of propaganda films and posters that would often resort to hateful and racist caricatures of their enemies. The reason military leaders did this on all sides was an attempt to ensure they had the full support of their citizens and military personnel to go and smite their foes with extreme prejudice and conviction. Needless to say, it proved effective. But for the soldiers who were on the front lines and fighting the good fight, whether in the air or on the ground, they would sometimes experience the unexpected that didn't always fit the image of their enemies as they were portrayed in the propaganda films and posters. This is one of those stories of one of those moments that proves that there is humanity and kindness on both sides of any war. It's a story that touches my heart like no other. This is the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler. And no, it's not about Charlie Brown, the Peanuts cartoon character made famous by Charles M. Schulz. But it is an incredible true-to-life story about a B-17 American bomber crew and their incredible tale of survival that wouldn't be told for over 40 years after the war ended. The reason for the story being classified was because the B-17 crew were told by their superior officers to never speak of it. Just like the surviving members of the HMT Rona, who I spoke about in my first video, who were also told to keep their story to themselves after being classified top secret. So, without further ado, let's revisit this incredible true story of Charlie Brown's B-17 crew and the German ace Franz Stigler. Charlie Brown was a young lieutenant pilot in the United States Air Force who was just 20 years old, but lied to the rest of his crew that he was 24 so they wouldn't lose confidence in him. This would be Charlie Brown and his crew's very first bombing mission into the heavily defended German town of Bremen to take out the Focke-Wulf airplane factory. The factory was defended by 250 German anti-aircraft guns and a force of closely to possibly 500 German fighters. It was December 20th, 1943, just 5 days before Christmas, when the B-17 bomber that Charlie and his crew flew into the heart of German-controlled territory. The B-17 was called Ye Old Pub and was given the unenviable far-left position on the very edge of the large formation of the B-17 attack squadron. This position that Brown's bomber occupied in that formation was sometimes called by experienced bomber pilots Purple Heart Corner. The reason that it was called that was because it was usually the first position that was attacked by German fighters. To make matters worse, this was a daylight bombing run and was much more dangerous than a nighttime run since they would easily be spotted by German defenders on the ground and in the air. As the bomber formation neared the city of Bremen, they were attacked by German fighters consisting of Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf fighter planes. American fighters engaged the German fighters, which allowed the B-17s to continue on to their target. As the bombers got close to Bremen, they were hit by heavy anti-aircraft fire from down below, causing shrapnel to shatter the plexiglass covering on the front nose of the plane. This caused very frigid cold air to go blasting through the bomber, which would prove to be very problematic for the crew. Another anti-aircraft shot hit the wing of the B-17 and took out the number 2 engine and further damaged engine number 4, which was already experiencing some issues before takeoff. This reduced the speed of the bomber, but it was still able to carry on and fly with the other 2 engines still operational. Other B-17s in the formation took direct hits and were seen by Charlie's crew as those poor souls in their B-17s went spiraling out of control towards the ground. Brown's B-17 began its 10-minute bomb run on the Bremen factory at 27,300 feet up in the air with an outside air temperature of minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit. The damage that the B-17 had sustained to its engines and frame slowed the bomber down, and Brown was unable to keep up with the remaining B-17 formation and was forced to fall back as a straggler. This would put Brown and his crew in a bad position to be attacked some more as they attempt to fly back to England. Brown's struggling B-17 was then attacked by over a dozen enemy fighters, which was a combination of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. For more than 10 minutes, the fighters attacked the B-17 from all angles, and the B-17 actually managed to shoot down 2 of the fighters, but further damage was sustained to the number 3 engine, reducing it to only half power, meaning the aircraft had effectively at best 40% of its total rated power available. When engine number 3 lost most of its power, Brown, who was injured in the shoulder by shrapnel, blacked out, as did his co-pilot, and the B-17 began to spiral down towards the ground. The remaining German fighters assumed the B-17 was going to crash and veered off, heading back to their base. As the B-17 neared the ground, Charlie Brown regained consciousness and just at the last moment pulled the plane up out of its death dive and leveled it out just above the treetops. In essence, it was Charlie and his co-pilot's blackout that saved their lives from being peppered by more enemy fighter planes. The bomber's internal oxygen, hydraulic, and electrical systems were also damaged, and the bomber had lost half of its rudder and its left side elevator as well as its nose cone. Radio communications were no longer possible, as well as they had been destroyed by enemy fire. Several of the gunners' weapons had jammed, most likely as a result of the loss on onboard electrical systems, leading to frozen firing mechanisms. This left the bomber with only 2 dorsal turret guns, plus one of the 3 forward-firing nose guns out of 11 available for defense. Many of the crew were wounded, and the tail gunner, Eckenrode, had been decapitated by a direct hit from a cannon shell. Crew member Yelisanka was critically wounded in the leg by shrapnel, and Blackford's feet were frozen due to shorted-out heating wires in his uniform. Crewman Pitchout had been hit in the eye by a cannon shell, and Brown was wounded in his right shoulder. The morphine syrettes carried on board had also frozen, complicating first aid efforts by the crew. With the radio being destroyed and the bomber's exterior heavily damaged, leaving gaping holes on the sides of the shattered plane, the crew discussed the possibility of bailing out of the aircraft. But with the realization that the crew member Yelisenko would not be able to make a safe landing with his leg injury, and unwilling to leave him behind in the plane, they all agreed to fly on. Brown's damaged low-flying bomber was spotted by the Germans on the ground, including Franz Stigler, who was an ace pilot with 27 victories under his wing. Stigler was refueling and rearming at an airfield when he spotted Brown's shredded B-17, and soon took off in his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6, which had a 50 caliber Browning machine gun bullet embedded in its radiator. This bullet lodged in his plane's engine could possibly cause the Bf-109's engine to overheat. Despite the risk of that happening, Franz Stigler hopped back in his freshly refueled fighter and quickly caught up with Brown's plane. As Franz Stigler approached the rear of Charlie Brown's B-17 to attack it, he was prepared for the rear tail gunner to start shooting at him. But that never happened. Instead of firing to take down the beleaguered bomber, he inched closer and noticed the tail gunner was no longer alive. The plane was nearly missing its entire tail section and was riddled with holes, and the sides of its canopy were flapping wildly in the cold wind as it limped along. He would later say that he had never seen a plane so badly damaged and still able to fly in his entire career. As a fighter pilot, Stigler's job was to shoot down enemy aircraft, something he had done quite well in his career as a fighter pilot. In the back of his mind, he remembered what one of his commanding officers, Gustav Rodel, had said to him when he was flying in North Africa. He said, "If I ever see or hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Stigler would later comment, "To me, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them and I couldn't shoot them down." Through openings torn in the damaged bomber's airframe by flak and machine gun fire, Stigler was able to see the injured and incapacitated crew and felt sympathetic towards the struggling and wounded B-17 occupants. The German ace did not open fire on the crippled bomber. Stigler instead pulled up alongside of the B-17, and it was then that Charlie Brown noticed him and a look of resignation and dread crossed his face. Charlie was expecting to be shot down by Stigler, but nothing happened. When Charlie looked back at the German pilot, Stigler motioned for them to land and surrender. Not sure what was really going on, Charlie shook his head no. Then Stigler motioned to fly to Sweden, a neutral country during the war, where they would be taken care of and interned for the rest of the war. Again, Charlie shook his head no and pointed in the direction of England. One of the B-17 crew climbed up to one of the few working machine gun turrets and aimed it at Stigler to let him know they didn't want to surrender or land. Stigler knew that as they approached the occupied coast of France, coastal German anti-aircraft guns would most likely shoot and blow the battered B-17 out of the sky, which was now flying much closer to the ground than it should be due to lack of engine power. What Stigler did next completely baffled Charlie and his surviving crew. Stigler took up a close escort position next to the bomber in the hopes that when German AA guns would spot them, they would also see his German Bf-109 and not shoot. The plan worked, and German AA guns held their fire as they watched the German fighter escort the B-17 to the open waters over the English Channel. Stigler then looked at Charlie one last time and saluted him. He then veered off and headed back to his base. Charlie and his crew were then spotted by two American fighter planes who escorted them to the nearest RAF field for an emergency landing. While over the English Channel, Charlie and his crew began dumping any excess equipment and gear from their plane that was weighing them down. The B-17, which was running out of fuel and nearing ever closer to the ground, ended up landing safely and were immediately attended to by British military and medical personnel. Soon after, Charlie Brown was debriefed by his superiors as to what happened. After telling his superiors the incredible and near unbelievable story, his superiors told him and his crew to never speak of this event to anyone. They immediately classified it as top secret. He was told not to repeat this to the rest of the unit so as not to build any positive sentiment about enemy pilots, lest other damaged bombers hold their fire on incoming fighter planes hoping to be rescued, only to be shot down. Brown would later comment, "Someone decided you can't be human and be flying in a German cockpit." As for Franz Stigler, he said nothing of the incident to his commanding officers, knowing that a German pilot who spared the enemy while in combat risked a court-martial and possible execution. After the war, Charlie Brown returned home to West Virginia and went to college, returning to the newly established U.S. Air Force in 1949 and serving until 1965. Later, as a U.S. State Department Foreign Service officer, he made numerous trips to Laos and Vietnam. In 1972, he retired from government service and moved to Miami, Florida to become an inventor and would eventually settle down in Seattle, Washington. Franz Stigler would eventually move to Canada in 1953 and became a successful businessman. Unbeknownst to the two pilots at the time, they were currently living only 200 miles away from each other. In 1986, the retired Lieutenant Colonel Brown was asked to speak at a combat pilot reunion event called A Gathering of Eagles at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Someone asked him if he had any memorable missions during World War II. Charlie thought for a minute and then recalled the story of the Bf-109 escort and the pilot salute. After telling his story, the crowd of veterans were stunned and speechless. They said he should try and locate the German pilot if possible. Afterwards, Brown decided he should try to find the unknown German pilot and began his investigation nearly 40 years later after that incredible incident. After 4 long years of searching vainly in records kept by the U.S. Army Air Forces, U.S. Air Force, and West German Air Force that might shed some light on who the other pilot was, Brown had come up with very little information. He then wrote a letter to a Combat Pilot Association newsletter. A few months later, he received a letter from Franz Stigler, who is now living in Canada. I was the one, the letter said. When they spoke on the phone, Stigler described his plane, the escort, and his salute, confirming everything that Brown needed to hear to know he was the German fighter pilot involved in the incident. When they first met, Franz hugged Charlie so hard, Charlie thought he was going to break his ribs. Charlie then brought out photographs of all the children and grandchildren of the surviving crew of the B-17 that Franz could have shot down that day back in 1943. Franz was overwhelmed with emotion upon seeing the photos of the lives he spared and teared up. Between 1990 and 2008, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became close friends and remained so until their deaths that happened within several months of each other in 2008. If you would like to read a very detailed account of this heroic and touching story, pick up and read the book A Higher Calling by Adam Makos. In closing, I would like to dedicate this video to Charlie Brown, his crew, and to Franz Stigler and all the surviving family members who were able to live and grow because of one man's compassion and bravery amidst the chaos and horror of war. I'm Moonlight Graham, and thanks for watching. Till next time.